Hey, welcome back. This is a live reading of chapter 18 of Hokey Pokey. May the circle be unbroken. The news that Spencer and Annette plan to reopen Hokey Pokey in a new location, one with big plate glass windows in front, one that promised to share the very same stretch of I-40 frontage road where all the big chain restaurants and outlet malls were located, shot through the collective post-traumatic, post-millennial consciousness of Cokeville, Tennessee, like a cathartic tweaker sprinting half naked through the middle of an old-timey country tent revival. The gossip was unignorable as the event itself. It had to be reckoned with, demanded to, one way or another, and on a personal level, too. You couldn't just look away. Spencer expected some of the organized response in time. And just as surely as he knew that they'd be coming, he knew that he'd be ready for them. After all, they'd need time to regroup. And even once they'd managed that part, they'd need time. They'd need to reanimate the topic itself as a matter of concern among the rest of the flock. That was going to be a tough row to hoe without effective leadership. Judge Reverend Goolsby, the only one of their number with rhetorical skills necessary to generate the level of social momentum they required to simply seem viable and potent, now received his mail via the postal clerk at Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary, where in time he had proven himself to be a model inmate. He climbed the ranks of internal leadership with the agility and fortitude of an alpha orangutan, making the link from block informant to prison fellow in less than a year. As a fellow, he enjoyed the same rights and privileges that he had enjoyed as a free man on the outside, but with far fewer responsibilities. That suited him. The last reliable rumor, which came via T, courtesy of Hygiene's ex-wife, running her mouth in the afterglow of a conjugal visit, had it that Reverend Judge had organized a sort of recovery group for fellow inmates. It was just like a 12-step program, except there were only 7 steps instead of 12. 7 was biblical. 12 was too, he said, but in more of a Jewish way. Also, or so he reasoned for the benefit of the not particularly anti-Semitic, 7 was less cumbersome and therefore a real time saver. On the Reverend Judge's 7-step plan, one could recover one's sobriety, sanity, and serenity with a maximum super American consumer style efficiency. He provided both the framework and the philosophy for the program, and he assumed the position of both spiritual and administrative leadership, welcoming each newcomer in person, face to face, with an excruciatingly long-winded personal witness. It was his own twisted little Damascus Road story, and he always started it the same way with, "I used to be all effed up on dope. Now I'm all effed up on the Lord." They printed t-shirts that all said, "all effed up on Jesus," and sold enough of them on the internet to finance a brand new set of free weights for the exercise yard. Code Talker moved back to the Honeycomb hideout after Mandy Bryant finally decided that he had become a bad influence on Old Slump, who had been all but useless since shortly after Code had moved out to the extra barn room, and whom she wanted to get his head in the game, what with the leaves already turning and the smell of winter on the morning air. "By God, we got shit needs doing and doing last month," she said, "and it ain't going to get done neither with yins traipsing all over the valley, creeping here and there all hours of the night, tending to dope patches and such. You ain't acted this loopy since Cotton gave you that shit that had you seeing daggum IBI hiding out yonder in the woodpile with binoculars. You need to tell your new friend that we appreciate his help, but he's got to go. I'll not say it again." Mandy was right, and maybe even a little prescient, too. There were other actors afoot, some known and unknown as yet, who could conspire to orchestrate a permanent return to the IBI, to Putnam County, and even as far into the hills as Martin Creek. If you knew what to feel for, you could feel them in the air. Nipper could feel them. So could Cotton. Even T nodded and said that, yep, she could feel them, too. "They're everywhere," she said. "But now more than ever, I can feel them out there scheming. You can't never underestimate the IBI. You can't. Bet your bottom dollar on it. You couldn't underestimate the dedication or persistence of the Invisible Bureau of Investigation any more than you could overestimate the foolishness that otherwise smart folks will get up to whenever they're so high and mighty that they can see down their noses at each other and each other's kin. Especially once you add religion or sex, or religion and sex together, and drugs of any sort, and bombs and such. In the end, it's a wonder to all who witnessed any part of the story that it got resolved without anybody ever getting hurt, except the old Reverend Judge Goolsby. Though people didn't tend to count that information since they reckoned and reckoned correctly, he had deserved whatever pain he suffered, probably a good deal more that he didn't suffer too. Plus, his pain was transformational, and as was Candy's. And to be honest, anybody else who had claimed to have suffered any, like T, for example. Nipper swears to this day that T is the one and only person he has ever met who was truly born again in the traditional old country tent revival sense of that phrase. He'd known hundreds who claimed to have been. He'd been there in person to witness at least a dozen of them getting took by the spirit and running the pews. But none of those people looked the way T did when she resurfaced during those first few days after the revival at Red Bowling Springs. You can see it in her eyes, he said. She's a new critter, man. I ain't sure what kind of critter now, but by God, it's a new one. The only soul to have suffered any real harm as a result of the burning of Hokey Pokey was poor old Jane, Slump Bryan's Vietnamese pot-bellied pig, whose cultural identity had coincidentally been called into question by Lewis Watson, a neighbor from down the valley with a strict set of internal laws regarding nomenclature, who, having stopped to help Slump butcher Jane after she'd been backed over accidentally by a tow truck driver and the county dispatched to retrieve Candy Goolsby's abandoned pig Eldorado, explained that them pot-bellied things ain't supposed to grow but so high, and positioned his hand palm downward just above one knee. It was true. Jane had grown far beyond the dimensions that were guaranteed by everything Slump had ever read on the internet regarding Vietnamese pot-bellied pigs. That made her far less desirable as a house pet, but infinitely more desirable as dinner. So it was not an event colored too much by tragedy when Slump invited Spencer and Tammy and Nipper and Code Talker and Cotton and a loose handful of other friends and kin down to Shangri-La to enjoy a small but lovingly prepared feast of pork tenderloin, ramps and field greens, muscadine wine on the evening of his famous annual Hoedown Come Shake Dick that year at Halloween. Anyone not directly involved in the events that summer, which was most folks, and even folks who were involved but had watched everything unfold from a distance, remembered the story of the arrest of the Reverend Judge Reverend Goolsby as a vaguely embarrassing item in the newspaper, seemingly but perhaps inevitable symptom of the coming apocalypse, and as such, an unavoidable factor in the occult mathematics of revelation. Any actual crimes that may have been committed related to the burning of Hokey Pokey were given a pass, chalked up to a case of things having taken care of themselves in the family, which is how local folk tended to finish the story of any unpleasantness that got resolved in such a way that precluded a feud or further investigation. And exactly how old Officer Throckmorton finished the report he wrote in his yellow legal pad one human morning that following August as he investigated a fresh crime scene in the clandestine speed lab, disguised as a camper trailer parked off in the woods along Mumbling Creek out near Muddy Pond, across the floor of which lay the newly deceased corpse of Donnie Hygiene Waldemar, who had been shot in the chest at point-blank range with a .357 Magnum, ostensibly by none other than T, who was now officially a fugitive from justice, one rumored to be riding a stolen Harley-Davidson, barefoot and bareheaded, like a bat out of hell, in the general direction of Ohio. By the following summer, life in Cookville had settled back into its natural rhythms. Once the social ripples caused by the sudden soft opening and then hard closing and reopening of Hokey Pokey had dissipated, it was hard to tell that anything noteworthy had happened at all in that sleepy little county on the Cumberland Plateau. At least, it was hard to tell from Main Street. The Reverend Judge Goolsby had long since been replaced at the First Mission Baptist Church, and though he and Candy were not forgotten, they were rarely spoken of among the congregation, except for now and then, and in whispers. Church ladies were still able to discover enough sin in other corners of the community to help them maintain a reasonable level of astonishment over the years, and enough charity to keep them busy, though they never found anything else worthy of picketing besides what they already had tucked away in their own closets at home. Now and then, one or two of them would still wander through the big jingling double doors down at Siesta Imports by accident in search of a set of tires for the family car, the way country folks did sometimes on monthly trips into town for provisions. Though if any of them made an appearance at the new Hokey Pokey location, they did so in disguise, and they came in strictly to shop. The end. That'll do her for Hokey Pokey, a novella about an adult toy store in the Buckle of Bible Bell. Thanks for joining me for that. Thank you for your support. Remember, there's a link to a print version in the description. You can avail one there. If not, please shoot me a like and subscribe for more stories and madness down the line. Thanks for joining me.